Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's have a nice look at international organizations that really try to enhance economic systems by kind of making them more economically liberalized. Let's start with globalization. Remember that globalization is the increased interconnectedness of people and countries, both economically and globally. It's important to remember that if you see this word on the AP exam, you must mention the interconnectedness of people and countries economically and culturally. It's not just simply about trade. Okay, it involves obviously worldwide markets for goods, services, and factors of production overall. It's not just like, oh, I'm buying something. No, it's entire markets that encompass everything worldwide. Political borders end up becoming much more transparent because goods, services, and factors of production are coming from different locations, and whatever is impacting those goods, services, factors of production actually end up impacting people in other countries. And so political borders get a little more um, transparent, vague, that kind of thing. Um, Pandemic is a perfect example. Political borders didn't matter when it came to the pandemic. COVID started in one country and quickly spread across the world. But the same is true about things like goods and services and ideas. Okay. And this often concerns governments when globalization really is hot and going because the government actually has less control over the economy than it's comfortable with. Because whatever happens somewhere else in the world does impact what happens in every other country. So what will happen is sometimes governments will try to wrangle control, and of course, governments don't usually do as well as private businesses and private owners at what to do with those factors of production. And finally, and really importantly, globalization exchanges and spreads ideas, technology, information, culture, power, that kind of thing. And globalization has started political revolutions. The Arab Spring during 2011, 2012 was a great example of that. When people look at, oh, they have a kind of way of living over here, they wonder, why can't I have that? Now, a lot of this comes from these markets being uh, much, we when we looked at this as an economic system, we focused it as a country. But now I want you to expand that and see this as maybe a global entity. That if you're the United States and you have a company like Google, and that's your businesses, the people in Mexico City can engage with this. Somebody from Mexico City might move to the United States or might do remote work from Mexico while and they go to the United States and get their income and wages from that company. And so all of a sudden, we have become a much more global company. You can have somebody in Lagos who works for a living, gets some money, and then goes and buys a Lenovo laptop, which is from China. And so, um, this keeps on circling and keeps on going. But when you have globalization, then the households and the firms can come from many different places, and factor markets and product markets just expand and get bigger. Now, for this to work, you need to have a government that is willing to let go of a lot of economic issues. And so this creates the need for economic globalization or liberalization. And we're not talking about liberalization as in triggering the libs kind of thing. No, we're talking about the idea of liberal meaning free. So economic liberalization is when countries create policies that reduce government action in an economic system, moving towards a more freer market. Economic liberalism is, hey, government has too much control of what goes on in economic choices. We want buyers and sellers to make more of those choices. It's the act of going from over here on the left side of your screen and having the government control less and going towards things like welfare capitalism, neoliberalism. In an extreme case, would be laissez faire, but there is really no advocating for purely free markets, just as there's no advocating for purely socialist markets. But moving more, well, on the screen, moving that way towards economically less government control, that is economic liberalization. Now, there's organizations around the world that actually work with countries to do this. They are often considered somewhat controversial. International Monetary Fund is a collection of countries and their banking systems that actually loan money to countries through the United Nations to try to get them economically more stable. Now, a lot of people look at this and say, well, this is countries in the north that are wealthier, basically being making poor countries kind of debt slaves. And the argument against that is, well, then they don't need the money. If they don't want to borrow it, then don't borrow it, and good luck. Um, so that's the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. All six AP6 countries are part of the IMF. The next economic organization is the World Bank. This is an international governmental organization, so it's a separate, what's called an IGO. It's a bunch of governments that come together on their own independently. And in this case, the World Bank provides money and technology to developing countries in an effort to really reduce poverty. And they do it through loans and grants. Some of the same controversy also happens with the World Bank. They kind of push towards economically being more liberal. All AP6 countries are also part of the World Bank. And finally, the World Trade Organization, which is an international governmental organization. So it's governments around the world coming together in an organization. And what they do is develop rules of trade between countries. And if there's some kind of unfair trading, maybe somebody like China is pricing their stuff so low that it undercuts American markets, then they would kind of duke it out within the WTO instead of like making a public spectacle of it, or doing tariffs, or God forbid, some kind of actual conflict. So the World Trade Organization is trying to work out essentially trade issues. This is the AP6 countries minus Iran, who is not a part of the WTO. Why do you become a part of economic organizations and become economically more liberal? One is to increase global trade. Obviously, the more people that you have access to, the more trade you can do, the more you can grow. Number two, there is a sense of global respect for countries that are part of economic organizations around the world. Like, more people are willing to do business with you, and they have more faith that you can actually get things done. Obviously, accessing other markets. When you join economic organizations, you're more likely to engage with trade with other members of those organizations. And then your people get access to goods and services that they may not have access for before. Obviously, grow your GDP or GDP per capita, as economically more liberal countries end up doing economic growth. But also, you may get exposure to these. These are private economic organizations. They are multinational corporations. These are corporations that have facilities in at least one country other than its home country. Of course, multinational corporations are controversial, but they have the opportunity to get within other markets, and they have the opportunity to spread, again, goods and services, culture, and multinational corporations can create economic growth. They also come with the controversy that's very legitimate. Multinational corporations are probably going to move places where there is cheaper labor and pay. Um, the argument on the other side of that is cheaper labor and pay compared to what? If it makes the people better off than what they were, that's good. If your expectation is somebody in Bangladesh is going to have the same standard of living as somebody in the United States, that's probably not going to happen if Amazon moves a factory there. Obviously, environmental damage is a concern. Corporations will move to locations that have, loose environmental laws, that really don't care about the environment and maybe really care about just making money. And so you can often see countries with weak governments allow for more environmental damage, and that creates all kinds of other externalities. Land rights, a lot of companies, especially when you get into fossil fuels, mining, that kind of thing, they don't really care about who owns the land. And if the government kind of agrees with that multinational corporation, you can have people losing their private property or historic or heritage sites, that kind of thing. Taxation. Multinational corporations may make agreements with governments and say, hey, for us to come here, you got to improve your roads, you got to improve your, make less laws around taxation, which of course puts more pressure on the people within the country to provide those taxes, or the people within the country to help pay taxes for like roads and development so that company will come. All right. Here's some examples of social impacts to economic liberalization. You have Nigerian oil destruction. A lot of that has to do with the Shell Gas Company and Chevron in the Niger Delta. And what this does is it increases civil society. So non-governmental organizations start to protest. They start to become more active. And this is, one result is that society will get greater activism going. Marginalized groups start to protest, student groups, indigenous groups. After NAFTA happens in the 1990s, you start to see more student groups, indigenous groups protests, almost led to a civil war in 1994. But and Chiapas is the poorest state in all of Mexico, and that is the very southern part of the state. Obviously, when companies come in and people start to protest, and you'll get the arrest of activists and protesters, and of course, media gets cracked down on. That's the case in China, Iran, and Russia, where you're really not going to be able to protest against the government or favored corporations very much. And then, when governments really get in the bed with multinational corporations, you'll start getting figures that'll pop up and become very nationalist. And these nationalist ideals will blame government for changes in our culture because of international organizations or multinational corporations. You see this with Xi Jinping in China, who will blame Japanese products and Japanese culture from seeping in. Putin in Russia, talking about non-ethnic Russians, especially from Middle and Near Eastern states, and AMLO and Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico, very populist ideas saying, look, the government was too connected with the United States and technology, and they're taking away our cultural roots. Okay, so we have our economic organizations. We have both government and non-government. There are definitely upsides and downsides to economic liberalization, but just make sure you do remember those particular economic organization groups.